"Excuse me, you need to move. This seat isn't for you." The words cut through the quiet cabin like a blade. Every head in first class turned toward the black woman sitting calmly by the window. She had just fastened her seatbelt, her eyes steady, her demeanor unshaken. The flight attendant stood rigid, arms crossed, her tone sharp enough to sting. Passengers shifted uneasily, sensing a storm brewing. The woman lifted her boarding pass with quiet certainty. "This is my seat." But the attendant's voice only grew louder, dripping with condescension. "First class is reserved for paying customers. You'll need to move to economy." Gasps spread. Whispers began. Some stared with pity, others with suspicion. The humiliation was public, sharp, and merciless. What no one realized, not the attendant, not the gawking passengers, was that this woman's true identity carried more authority than anyone on that plane could imagine. The cabin had fallen silent, heavy with tension. A woman's dignity was under attack, and strangers watched without moving. In moments like this, the question becomes unavoidable. What would you have done if you were there? Would you have spoken up, or stayed silent like the rest? Your voice matters here. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these stories are about more than just one flight. They're about how we treat each other every single day. And if you believe dignity deserves defending, subscribe now. This story is only just beginning. Her calm refusal to move, the steady way she held her boarding pass, left passengers curious. Who was this woman, really? To the flight attendant, she was just another traveler who didn't belong in first class. But her story stretched far beyond the cabin of that airplane. Her name was Judge Vanessa Williams. At 48 years old, she had spent nearly half her life in courtrooms where every word carried weight. Every judgment had consequences. By the time she took her seat that day, she had earned respect that stretched from law schools to federal chambers. Yet on this flight, not a single person around her knew the battles she had fought to sit where she was. That morning had begun quietly. Vanessa rose before sunrise in her modest brick home just outside Washington, D.C. She brewed her coffee the same way she always did. One scoop too strong, just how her late father had taught her. As she sipped, she looked over the notes for the keynote speech she was set to deliver. Her destination wasn't a vacation or a business trip. She was heading to a legal conference in Atlanta, where she would stand before hundreds of young attorneys and law students, many of them women of color, and remind them that justice was not some distant dream. It was a calling, and it required persistence, patience, and sacrifice. The suitcase by her door wasn't filled with luxury. 2 carefully pressed suits, her well-worn leather briefcase, and a stack of handwritten index cards that had carried her through every public speech she'd ever given. To the outside world, she was a federal judge with power few could imagine. But at home, she was simply Vanessa, the daughter of a bus driver and a school teacher, raised on values that taught her the worth of dignity, even in the face of disrespect. Her childhood had not been easy. She grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in the late 70s and 80s, a city still scarred by the echoes of segregation. As a young girl, she watched her mother get passed over for promotions in the local school district, always for someone better suited. She watched her father work double shifts behind the wheel of a city bus, his hands rough, his eyes tired, but his voice steady when he told her, "Baby girl, you're going to have to fight twice as hard to get half as far, but you fight anyway." She carried those words with her into law school. The first semester at Harvard was brutal. Surrounded by students from powerful families and wealthy backgrounds, she often felt like an outsider. Professors called on her less, peers underestimated her more, but late nights in the library, her fingers stained with ink and her eyes burning from exhaustion, she pushed through. She graduated not just near the top of her class, but as one of the few who left with both academic excellence and the admiration of classmates who had underestimated her. Her career after law school was marked by the same quiet perseverance. She started in public defense, often representing clients who had been tossed aside by a system that barely saw them as human. She faced ridicule from opposing counsel, patronizing smirks in the courtroom, and a mountain of caseloads that threatened to break her. Yet, she endured. Each case was a chance to prove that justice wasn't about the loudest voice. It was about the fairest one. By her mid-30s, Vanessa's reputation was impossible to ignore. When she was appointed as one of the youngest black women to serve as a federal judge, headlines called it historic. But she didn't think of herself as a headline. To her, the robe wasn't a symbol of power. It was a responsibility, a reminder that every person who stood before her, whether in chains or in a suit, deserved to be treated with humanity. And yet, even after all those years of service, she still faced the subtle, exhausting drip of prejudice in her daily life. The stares when she walked into luxury stores, the questions at gala events where guests assumed she was someone's assistant, the moments of disbelief when she introduced herself as Judge Williams. She bore it with the same grace she carried into court, but the scars ran deep. That morning, as she zipped her suitcase and stepped into the car that would take her to the airport, she had no idea another test of her dignity was waiting. At the gate, she smiled at the young ticketing agent, handed over her pass, and walked down the jet bridge like any other traveller. No security detail, no special treatment. Just Vanessa, carrying her own bag, boarding a flight like everyone else. When she found her seat in first class, she sank into it with a sigh of relief. Not because of the luxury, the wide leather seat and extra legroom meant little to her, but because she finally had a moment to breathe before the long day ahead. She thought about her speech in Atlanta, about the young women who would look up at her from the audience and see possibility in her story. She thought about her father, who never lived to see her wear the robe, and she thought briefly about how far she had come from those narrow Birmingham streets. But peace is fragile, and it shattered the moment that shadow fell over her seat. The attendant's voice, sharp and dismissive, pulled her back to a reality she knew all too well. She wasn't being seen as a judge, or even as a customer. She was being seen as someone who didn't belong. Vanessa didn't move, not because of pride, but because of principle. She had fought her whole life to claim space in rooms where others thought she shouldn't be. And this cramped airplane cabin at 30,000 feet, was no different. Who was she really? To the passengers who glanced at her, and to the flight attendant who towered over her with folded arms, she was just another traveller occupying a seat she didn't deserve. But the truth ran far deeper. Her name was Judge Vanessa Williams, and every wrinkle of her smile, every calm gesture of her hand, was the result of decades spent fighting uphill battles. That day had begun like any other. The sun had barely risen when Vanessa woke in her quiet brick home on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. She brewed her coffee the way her father had always liked. Strong enough to chase away fatigue in a single sip. Sitting at her kitchen table, she reviewed her notes for the keynote speech she would deliver in Atlanta later that evening. Her topic was one that defined her career. Justice, not as a lofty principle, but as something lived and fought for in the smallest of moments. The suitcase at her door wasn't packed with extravagance, just 2 crisp suits folded with care, a single leather-bound journal, and a stack of handwritten index cards. On them were phrases she had rehearsed in her mind for weeks. Words meant to inspire the young lawyers she would soon address, many of them women and men who, like her once, wondered if the system had room for them. Though she wore the robe of a federal judge now, Vanessa never forgot the long road that had carried her there. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, she came of age in a city still bruised by the weight of segregation. She remembered how her mother, a dedicated schoolteacher, was always overlooked for promotions that went instead to less qualified colleagues. She remembered her father, a city bus driver, returning home late, his hands calloused, his voice hoarse, but his eyes full of faith. "Baby girl," he'd say, "you'll have to work twice as hard to get half as far, but you fight anyway. You don't quit, because that's how they win." Those words were carved into her spirit. She carried them with her through high school, into the halls of Harvard Law, and through nights in the library, when exhaustion pressed on her shoulders like a physical weight. She was often the only black woman in a room filled with privilege, often underestimated, sometimes ignored. Yet time after time, she answered condescension with excellence and silence with resilience. When she graduated near the top of her class, professors who had once doubted her now recommended her with pride. But Vanessa never considered her journey complete. Instead, she began her career as a public defender, standing beside clients who had been written off by the system, men and women who rarely saw compassion in courtrooms. In those days, she didn't earn much money, and she endured ridicule from opposing counsel who sneered at her youth, her gender, and her race. But she endured. Every client was a reminder of why she chose the law in the first place. By her mid-30s, Vanessa's reputation for fairness and unshakable composure became impossible to ignore. When she was appointed to the federal bench, newspapers ran headlines calling it historic. Yet she never thought of herself as a trailblazer. She thought of herself as her father's daughter, still carrying the weight of his advice, still answering prejudice with quiet persistence. And though the robe commanded respect in the courtroom, the world outside often refused to see her for who she was. At charity galas, people mistook her for a staff member. At airports, strangers asked if she was traveling on someone else's ticket. In high-end stores, she was shadowed by clerks who assumed she couldn't afford what she touched. Each moment was a cut, small, dismissible in isolation, but together forming scars that ran deep. That morning, as she left her house and climbed into the car that would take her to the airport, she carried with her not just a suitcase, but the quiet fatigue of a lifetime of being doubted. Still, she smiled at the driver, thanked him when he lifted her bag, and walked into the terminal with the posture of someone unwilling to let bitterness weigh her down. At the gate, she greeted the young ticketing agent with warmth. She accepted her boarding pass, thanked the woman, and walked down the jet bridge like any other passenger. No security detail trailed behind her. No assistants carried her bags. She never needed fanfare. She believed dignity was best expressed in simplicity. When she entered the first-class cabin, Vanessa settled into her seat by the window. She placed her bag neatly beneath. The chair fastened her seatbelt and finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She thought of her upcoming speech, of the wide-eyed law students who would see her on that stage, and realized that possibility didn't belong to someone else. It belonged to them, too. She thought of her late father, who never saw her wear the robe, but would have been proud of every step she had taken. But dignity is fragile, and peace can be shattered in an instant. As she exhaled and leaned back, the shadow fell across her seat. A pair of polished shoes, the sharp click of heels, and then a voice, curt, dismissive, and edged with disbelief. "Ma'am, you're in the wrong seat. First class is reserved for paying customers. You'll need to move to economy." The words pierced the air like an accusation. And for Judge Vanessa Williams, who had fought her whole life to claim space where others believed she didn't belong, it was another test, another reminder that no matter how high she climbed, prejudice was never far behind. The attendant's voice was sharp enough to draw glances from nearly every passenger in the first-class cabin. Conversations hushed, newspapers lowered, and phones slipped out of hands as attention turned toward the quiet woman in the window seat. Judge Vanessa Williams didn't flinch. She simply held out her boarding pass with a measured calm, her eyes steady. "This is my seat," she said softly. But the flight attendant didn't even glance at the pass. She folded her arms tighter, her chin lifting in defiance. "Ma'am, I've worked this route for years. I know the manifest, and I know who belongs up here. You'll need to gather your things and head to economy before we push back from the gate." The words weren't just instructions. They carried accusation. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some avoided eye contact altogether, their eyes fixed on the glossy magazines in their laps. Others exchanged curious looks, their expressions caught between disbelief and silent judgment. Vanessa tried again, her voice still even. She raised the boarding pass closer, tilting it so the light revealed her name in bold letters. "This is seat 3A. My name is here, printed clearly." Still, the attendant dismissed it with a shake of her head. "I've seen this before," she said, her voice pitched louder now, making sure more ears heard. "Sometimes people wander into the wrong section, or they think they can just sit here until someone stops them. But you can't, and I'm stopping you now." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A man across the aisle lowered his glasses, peering at the confrontation with undisguised curiosity. Two college-aged women in the row behind Vanessa whispered to one another, their eyes darting nervously between the attendant and the seated passenger. Vanessa inhaled slowly, pressing her palms against her knees to steady herself. She could feel the heat of humiliation rising in her chest, but years of discipline had trained her to control her expression. She spoke without raising her voice, each word chosen carefully. "I am not mistaken. I am in the correct seat. Kindly check the list again." But the attendant had no intention of backing down. Instead, she leaned closer, her tone coated with something bitter. "You know, first class isn't just about buying a ticket. It's about a certain kind of passenger, people who actually belong here." That last phrase lingered in the air like smoke. Belong here. Several passengers stiffened. Some frowned at the cruelty embedded in the remark. Others sank deeper into their seats as though unwilling to be part of the unfolding spectacle. Vanessa's grip tightened on the boarding pass. She considered her words carefully. "I paid for this ticket, just as every other person here did. I ask you again, please check the manifest." The attendant's lips curved into a smirk that barely masked her irritation. She straightened her posture and in a voice meant to carry announced, "Folks, we've got a little mix-up. This passenger seems to think she's in first class, but unfortunately that's not the case. She'll be moved shortly so we can depart on time." A wave of whispers swept the rows. Some passengers shook their heads, disapproving of how openly the humiliation was being broadcast. Others exchanged skeptical glances, silently questioning whether the woman by the window had indeed taken a seat that wasn't hers. Vanessa closed her eyes for the briefest moment. In that silence she remembered her father's words. "You'll have to fight twice as hard to get half as far, but fight anyway." Her eyes opened again, clear and unwavering. She raised her pass higher this time, extending it toward the attendant. "My name is Judge Vanessa Williams, and this is my assigned seat. You may confirm it yourself." For a flicker of a second, uncertainty passed over the attendant's face, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened glare. "Judge?" she said, dripping skepticism. "Ma'am, making things up won't help you. We don't play games with titles here." The cruelty of the statement struck deeper than the others. To accuse her not only of lying, but of fabricating her very identity, was a humiliation that cut to the bone. The man across the aisle finally spoke, his voice cautious. "Maybe she's right. Maybe just check the list. It'll take 2 seconds." The attendant shot him a glare that silenced him instantly. Then she turned back to Vanessa, her patience clearly thinning. "If you don't move now, I'll have to call the captain and have security escort you off this flight. Do you really want it to come to that?" A collective breath caught in the cabin. The word security always carried a dangerous edge, especially in a post-9/11 world where airplane confrontations could escalate into headlines within hours. Vanessa's heart thudded, but she held her composure. "I am not moving from the seat I lay." "Fully purchased," she replied. Her voice was steady, but her hands folded neatly in her lap, pressed against one another tightly enough that her knuckles paled. The attendant leaned in, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper meant only for her. "People like you should know their place." The words were icy, slicing through Vanessa's resolve. She felt the sting, not just for herself but for every slight, every subtle dismissal she had endured across her lifetime. The whispers in luxury stores, the stares in hotel lobbies, the assumptions at banquets. This moment condensed them all into one cruel sentence. Behind her, the two young women gasped audibly. One reached for her phone, tilting it just enough to capture what was happening. The camera lens caught the rigid stance of the attendant, the stillness of the seated passenger, and the tension that hung in the air like an electric storm. Vanessa glanced around briefly. She saw pity in some eyes, discomfort in others. No one was standing. No one was moving. The burden of this confrontation remained hers alone. She turned back to the attendant, her voice still calm. "I have asked you to confirm the manifest. Until you do, I am remaining where I am." The attendant scoffed, turned sharply on her heel, and marched toward the galley. Her words echoed back into the cabin. "Unbelievable." The passengers sat in silence, the unease thick. Some looked at Vanessa with sympathy, others with doubt. But one thing was certain: the humiliation was not private anymore. It had been staged before an unwilling audience, loud and relentless. Moments later, the attendant returned, still radiating indignation. She stopped at Vanessa's seat again, arms folded. "Last chance," she said flatly. "Move, or this plane isn't leaving the ground." Vanessa lifted her chin ever so slightly, the light from the window catching in her eyes. Her view, ice was calm, resolute and unwavering. "Then this plane will wait." The silence that followed was deafening. The silence after Vanessa's final words, "Then this plane will wait," was heavy enough to press against every passenger in the cabin. The attendant stood rigid, lips parted as though she had been struck by something invisible. Her authority, which she had wielded like a weapon only moments before, now faltered against the quiet certainty in the judge's voice. And yet, Vanessa did not gloat. She did not raise her tone or meet contempt with anger. Instead, she settled back into her seat, folded her boarding pass neatly, and placed it back into her leather case. She straightened the hem of her blazer, smoothed it over her lap, and sat with the stillness of someone who refused to be dragged into chaos. That was the difference. She had spent her life in courtrooms where shouting voices demanded attention, where tempers boiled over and pride ruined men. She had learned that true power wasn't in noise, it was in restraint. The attendant, flustered and red-cheeked, muttered something under her breath and stormed back toward the galley. But the damage was already done. The whispers began again, louder this time. "Did you hear what she said to her? Unbelievable. Why won't she just check the list?" One man near the back of first class sighed and shook his head. "This is ridiculous," he said to no one in particular. "She showed her boarding pass. What else do they want?" Meanwhile, 2 rows behind Vanessa, the young woman with the phone kept recording. Her hands trembled, but she knew what she was capturing mattered. The camera lens focused on Vanessa's face, calm, composed, though her eyes revealed the faintest glimmer of pain. The phone also caught the shifting atmosphere around her, the furtive glances, the nervous coughs, the uncomfortable silence of those who wanted to intervene but didn't. Minutes passed like hours. The hum of the air conditioning, the shuffle of passengers adjusting in their seats, and the faint rustle of magazines all filled the void left by the confrontation. Vanessa did not look at the attendant again. She did not look at the passengers either. She simply stared out the oval window, her reflection faint in the glass, her mind running through 100 memories of moments just like this, times when dignity was tested, when composure was mistaken for weakness, when silence was the only shield left. And then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into her bag. Her fingers closed around her phone. She lifted it with a grace that seemed almost ceremonial, as though this small device, held in her palm, carried the weight of something greater than anyone in that cabin could imagine. She unlocked it with a quick touch, scrolled briefly, and pressed a single name. The call connected after 1 ring. Her voice was soft but steady, clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Yes, it's me. I'm on the plane now. There's been an incident. She paused, listening. Then her tone shifted, calm but edged with authority. I need you to inform the Chief Administrator immediately. Make sure they are aware this is happening as we speak. The passenger across the aisle blinked, glancing from her to his neighbour. Chief Administrator? He mouthed. The neighbour only shrugged, wide-eyed. Vanessa continued, her words clipped but firm. No, I am not raising my voice. No, I am not leaving the aircraft. But I want this documented. Do you understand? Yes. Thank you. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her case, her expression unchanging. The murmurs swelled. Passengers exchanged bewildered looks. Who had she called? What administrator? The tone of her voice suggested someone important, someone who had the power to turn this moment into something much larger. The young woman recording whispered to her friend, She doesn't sound scared at all. Her friend nodded, still filming. She sounds like she's in charge. Moments later, the flight attendant returned, this time with another crew member in tow. The second attendant, older and clearly higher ranked, crouched slightly at Vanessa's row, forcing a brittle smile. Ma'am, we're just trying to make sure everything is in order. Could I see your boarding pass, please? Without a word, Vanessa handed it over. The attendant studied it carefully, tracing the bold letters of her name. Vanessa Williams. Seat 3A. His eyes flickered, his lips tightening. He handed it back with a curt nod. Thank you, ma'am. But the first attendant, the one who had started the confrontation, still hovered behind him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but his glare silenced her before she could. The older attendant retreated, and the two disappeared toward the galley. Yet the whispers did not stop. The passengers had seen enough to understand what had happened. The humiliation, the dismissal, the venom in the words people like you. And now, the calm, measured phone call had planted a seed of suspense. Who exactly was this woman? Vanessa remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh. She waited. Her silence carried more weight than 1,000 arguments. It unsettled the crew, unnerved the passengers, and lingered in the air like a warning. Minutes later, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay as we finalize some administrative matters. We appreciate your patience. The passengers exchanged curious looks. Administrative matters? No one had ever heard such phrasing before. The woman recording nudged her friend. That's because of her. I know it. Her friend nodded, gripping the phone tighter. The cabin filled again with restless sounds. Coughs, sighs, shifting feet. But beneath it all was a current of tension, a growing sense that something larger was unfolding, something none of them fully understood yet. And at the center of it all sat Judge Vanessa Williams, silent, steady, and unshaken. What no one realized, not the attendant, not the pilot, not even the passengers clutching their phones, was that the single call she had just made was about to change everything. The minutes dragged, the plane still grounded, the passengers restless. The attendant who had sparked the confrontation shifted uneasily in the galley, her jaw tight, her eyes flicking toward Vanessa's row again and again. She tried to appear in control, but the sweat gathering at her temple betrayed her. Vanessa remained motionless, her posture regal, her silence more cutting than any protest. She had been humiliated in front of strangers, accused of not belonging in a seat she had rightfully purchased, dismissed as if her very presence was an error. And still, she had not raised her voice. But then, something shifted. The young woman recording whispered, "She's going to say something." Vanessa reached for her case again. Slowly, with a precision that made every eye follow her movements, She withdrew not her boarding pass, but a small leather-bound wallet. She opened it and set it on the tray table in front of her. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Inside the case, gleaming under the fluorescent light, was her official government identification, the embossed seal, the unmistakable title, the name printed in bold letters, the Honorable Vanessa M. Williams, United States Federal Judge. For a heartbeat, the plane went silent. No coughs, no whispers, not even the shuffle of restless feet. Only silence. Thick, stunned, reverent. Vanessa raised her eyes, calm and steady, her voice even as she spoke. "My name," she said, "is Judge Vanessa Williams. I was confirmed by the United States Senate to uphold the Constitution of this country. I have spent my career ensuring that fairness and dignity are not denied to anyone who appears before me. And today I was treated as though I were less than the very rights I swore to protect." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. The flight attendant who had challenged her froze, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The flush in her cheeks deepened into a crimson mask of horror. Her hands, which had once been so quick to gesture her out of first class, now fidgeted with the edge of her uniform. "I asked you only to check the manifest," Vanessa continued, her tone steady. "Instead, you chose to humiliate me. You chose to assume that I could not belong here. And that choice, ma'am, is now documented. By me, by my office, and by the very passengers who witnessed it." Every head turned toward the woman with the phone. She did not lower it. Her screen caught the light of the ID card, the judge's face, the stunned attendant hovering nearby. Already, the video was pinging out to the world beyond that cabin, a digital echo of injustice spreading faster than the plane itself could ever fly. The second attendant returned, face pale, his eyes darting between Vanessa and his trembling colleague. He bent closer, voice hushed. "Ma'am, Judge Williams, please accept our apologies. This was a misunderstanding." Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "A misunderstanding is when someone accidentally steps on your foot. This was an assumption rooted in bias, and I do not accept it." Her calmness cut deeper than anger ever could. The murmurs swelled. Passengers shook their heads. A man muttered, "She's a federal judge." "My God." Another whispered, "That woman's career is over." The attendant who had begun it all finally tried to speak. Her voice cracked, small, unsteady. I didn't mean—" Vanessa raised a hand, silencing her without effort. "You meant every word you said, and words have consequences." The cabin seemed to shrink around the crew. What once had been their stage of authority now felt like a courtroom, and in that courtroom, Judge Vanessa Williams presided. The pilot's voice broke in, over the intercom, unsteady, halting. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret the delay. We've been informed of an issue that is being resolved. Please remain seated as we prepare for departure." But his attempt at control only underlined the reality. Control was no longer his, nor the crew's. The woman with the phone leaned toward her friend, whispering urgently, "It's already online. Look, Twitter, TikTok, everywhere. It's gone viral in minutes." Her friend's jaw dropped. "That fast?" She nodded. "The whole world's seeing this." The attendant's face drained of color as she realized it too. This was no longer just about a seat in first class. It was about the collapse of her authority, her professionalism, her career. And it had all unfolded in front of a federal judge with an unshakable memory and an unflinching voice. Vanessa closed the wallet, placed it gently back into her bag, and folded her hands once more in her lap. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. Her silence now thundered with power. The crew shifted nervously, their hushed arguments in the galley carrying faintly into the cabin. The passengers exchanged looks of disbelief, some nodding quietly in solidarity with Vanessa, others pulling out their own phones to search for the viral clip already gaining traction. The woman with the phone whispered, almost reverently, "She didn't even raise her voice." Her friend nodded. "That's how you know she's the real deal." And so, in that suspended moment in the sky, the truth had been revealed. She was not just another passenger. She was a judge, one of the youngest black women ever appointed to the federal bench, a woman whose very life was a testament to perseverance against prejudice. The humiliation she endured had been witnessed. The truth she revealed had silenced the room, and the quiet power she held in her presence alone was now shaping the destiny of those who had dared to doubt her. What no one realized was that the story had already escaped the confines of that aircraft. The world beyond the cabin was watching, and the reckoning for those responsible was only beginning. The video left the cabin long before the plane did. By the time wheels touched down, millions had already seen it. A black woman, calm, dignified, silenced for too long, revealing she was, in fact, a sitting federal judge. The clip looped endlessly online. The attendant's sharp voice, her refusal to look at the boarding pass, her final stunned silence when the ID appeared. It spread with wildfire speed. Hashtags ignited. # respect in the sky. # flying while black. # Judge Williams. Each carried the fury of strangers who recognized not just one woman's humiliation, but a pattern far too familiar. By evening, major news outlets had picked it up. Anchors replayed the footage, their brows furrowed, their voices edged with disbelief. "How does something like this happen in 2025? They asked. Civil rights advocates appeared on panels, dissecting every second of the exchange. They spoke of bias, of dignity denied, of how power only seemed to be respected when it was displayed on government letterhead. Inside corporate headquarters, the airline scrambled. Executives held emergency meetings in glass towers, their polished shoes tapping against marble floors as they argued over damage control. A memo was drafted, then scrapped, then rewritten with softer language, then hardened again when shareholders called in fury. At first, the airline issued a statement of regret. It was carefully worded, full of corporate polish. "We are aware of the incident involving a passenger and a member of our crew. We take these matters seriously and are conducting a full investigation." But the public wasn't having it. Comments flooded in by the thousands. "An investigation? The video shows everything." She showed her ticket. She showed her ID. What else do you need? The stock market, notice too, share, is dipped as investors worried about boycotts. Travel bloggers posted videos promising never to fly the airline again. Families shared stories of their own mistreatment at airports, on planes, in lobbies where they were seen as less than what their tickets said they were entitled to. The pressure became unbearable. Within 48 hours, the airline announced that the crew members directly involved had been relieved of duty. Within a week, the word changed. Fired. The flight attendant who had insisted Vanessa belonged in economy was gone. Her name splashed across gossip sites, her face frozen forever in screenshots from the viral clip. The second attendant, though less vocal, was also dismissed for failing to intervene. The captain released a written apology of his own, but it came too late. On the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed. Judge Williams did not seek cameras. She never raised her voice, even then. But when asked what message she hoped this ordeal carried, she answered with the same clarity she had shown in the cabin. This was never about a seat. This was about dignity. Dignity must not depend on titles, uniforms, or appearances. Every person who walks onto a plane or into a courtroom or down a city street is entitled to the same respect. I carry a title, yes, but long before that, I carried the burden of being doubted. That's the weight too many carry, and that must change. Her words were replayed across networks, clipped and shared online until they too went viral. The judge had turned humiliation into testimony, and testimony into truth. The airline's brand, once polished and aspirational, became a cautionary tale in business schools. Marketing professors pointed to the failure of corporate response. Law professors used the video to illustrate implicit bias. Activists cited it as proof that progress still required vigilance. But perhaps the most telling consequence was quieter. In airports across the country, flight crews received hurried retraining. They sat through videos on unconscious bias, on cultural sensitivity, on the damage a single assumption could cause. Posters went up in break rooms, reminding staff that every passenger matters. The humiliation Judge Williams endured could not be undone. But its echo forced a reckoning larger than one airline, larger than one flight. For passengers, it became a story to remember the next time they saw someone treated unfairly. For corporations, it was a lesson that silence and delay could cost millions. For those who still doubted whether injustice lived in everyday moments, it was undeniable proof, captured in a clip less than 2 minutes long. And through it all, the face of Judge Vanessa Williams remained steady in the public imagination. Not because she shouted, but because she didn't. Not because she threatened, but because she revealed. Her authority had spoken for itself, and the world had listened. When the storm of headlines faded and the cameras turned elsewhere, Judge Vanessa Williams returned to her chambers. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished oak and paper, its marble halls echoing with the shuffle of clerks and lawyers carrying heavy files. For Vanessa, it was a familiar rhythm, steady, grounding, far from the turbulence of that flight. She had not asked for attention. She had not wanted to become a viral symbol. Yet she knew that silence in moments of humiliation only fed the cycle. Her decision to reveal her identity had not been about pride. It had been about truth, and about showing the world in one quiet gesture that dignity can never be dictated by someone else's prejudice. At night, when she sat alone by her lamp, the images replayed in her mind: the attendant's raised chin, the passenger's nervous whispers, the hush that followed her words. She felt no triumph in remembering it. No gloating satisfaction that careers had ended, or that an airline had stumbled. Instead, she felt something quieter, deeper. A weight lifted. She had not sought revenge. She had sought recognition of her humanity. And in that cabin, for a brief and piercing moment, the world had been forced to see it. But the lesson was never meant to stop at her story. Vanessa often thought about the countless others who had endured similar treatment without titles, without credentials to flash, without cameras to record the truth. They too had been doubted, dismissed, diminished. Their stories rarely went viral. Their pain rarely saw justice. That was the part that lingered most. True power, she believed, does not lie in shouting down an opponent or in demanding the world bow to a title. True power lies in restraint, in knowing when to speak, and letting silence carry its own authority until the right moment arrives. She thought of her parents, who had raised her with that lesson, of her professors, who had taught her to argue fiercely but live humbly, of her journey, marked not by anger, but by persistence. And now she thought of the passengers on that flight. How many of them had walked away changed, their own eyes open to the weight of assumption. Her story had travelled farther than she could. Across oceans, into homes she would never enter, into conversations among strangers debating respect and fairness. And in that way, perhaps it was never just her story at all. It belonged to everyone who had been told they did not belong. The world would forget the names of those flight attendants. The headlines would fade. The hashtags would be replaced. But what would remain was the question this moment forced each of us to ask: how do we treat the people sitting beside us when no one is watching? Do we measure them by the labels we assume, or by the dignity they are owed? And more personally, When it is our turn to act, when some sauce, ni else is diminished in front of us, do we stay silent or do we stand? Vanessa's answer had been clear, not in words, but in composure. She had shown that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits. Sometimes it is revealed in the quiet confidence of a woman who knows who she is, no matter what others say. As her chambers emptied one evening, she lingered at her desk, closing a file and staring briefly at the seal embossed on her leather case. She touched it lightly, then set it aside. It was a symbol of her position, yes, but her dignity had never depended on it. She smiled faintly, knowing that this was the lesson worth remembering. For titles may fade, careers may end, airlines may crumble, but dignity, when defended, becomes eternal. And so I ask you, listening now, in your own moments of choice, how will you act? How will you treat those around you, especially when no one else is paying attention? Because at the end of all our stories, we are not remembered for the seats we sat in, or the power we held, but for the kindness or cruelty we showed in the moments that mattered most. So tell me, how would you want to be remembered, in moments of power or in moments of kindness?